On March 21, 2025, a message lit up my phone. Your number is blocked. You can no longer contact the family. My heart froze. My son had been gone 2 weeks, the smell of lilies from the funeral still clinging to my coat, and in one sentence I was erased. I sat at the kitchen table, the fridge humming like it always had, staring at a thick envelope I hadn't opened yet. Inside were documents for the sale of our old house. The paper felt heavier than it should have. The signature at the bottom carried my name, written in a hand that wasn't mine. I traced the ink with my finger, slow and careful, as if it might explain itself. I remember thinking how quiet the room was, how even my grief seemed to pause. That was the moment I understood something had been taken from me, something far beyond a house. If you want to know how I got revenge and regained control, subscribe. I am Laurel, 55 years old, and I have spent my life building things slowly so they would last. I balanced checkbooks before there were apps to do it for you. I worked through layoffs, overtime, and years when sleep came in short pieces. Stability mattered to me. Not the flashy kind, but the quiet kind that keeps the lights on and the heat steady through winter. I believed money was a tool, not a weapon, and I used it to protect the people I loved. When my son was alive, I helped without keeping score. I paid medical bills when insurance ran thin. I covered tuition gaps so classes wouldn't be dropped. I wrote checks for roof repairs, appliance replacements, and one winter furnace emergency that still makes me wince. Tens of thousands over the years, maybe more. I never added it up because family isn't an invoice. I told myself that love, once given, should be free of conditions. Jessica came into my life already used to leaning. She leaned on my son first, then on me. At the beginning, she thanked me often. She brought coffee when she visited and called me Mom, with a soft voice that sounded sincere. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. When she asked for help, it always sounded temporary, always framed as a bridge to something better. I told myself that bridges are meant to be crossed, not counted. Over time, the thanks grew thinner. The coffee stopped appearing. Requests came without context, like assumptions already agreed upon. When I hesitated, even once, her tone shifted. Not angry, cool. As if my role had been quietly reassigned from supporter to obstacle. I noticed it but didn't name it. Naming things makes them real, and I wasn't ready. I was proud of what I had built. A paid-off house. Savings that could absorb a crisis. A reputation for reliability. That pride slowly curdled into something else when I realized it had become expected, not respected. I was no longer the woman who helped. I was the system that was supposed to work on demand. After my son died, I assumed grief would pull us closer, at least for a while. Shared loss usually does. Instead, I felt something close around me. Conversations shortened. Decisions happened without me. I was informed, not included. When I offered help, it was accepted without warmth, like picking up a package left on the porch. Looking back, I see how easily pride turns into vulnerability. I believed my consistency made me safe. I believed my generosity earned me a place. I didn't see how dependence, left unchecked, can rot into entitlement. Jessica didn't wake up one day and decide to take from me. She had been doing it in smaller ways for years, and I had been calling it family. The bitterness surprised me when it arrived. It wasn't loud. It settled in quietly, the way dust does when no one is watching. I still loved my son. I still cared about his family. But somewhere in the middle of all that care, I had been reduced to a resource. And resources, I would soon learn, are easy to erase when they stop cooperating. The first crack came a year before my son died, on an afternoon that felt ordinary enough to forget. We were standing in her kitchen, the smell of reheated soup lingering in the air, when I mentioned, gently, that refinancing might ease some of the pressure she kept describing. I wasn't lecturing. I wasn't insisting. I was offering the same kind of practical help I always had. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even turn around. She kept her back to me and said, "I don't need your advice." The words landed clean and sharp. I remember blinking, once, like dust had gotten in my eyes. I smiled anyway. I said something neutral, maybe, of course, and reached for my coat. On the drive home, I told myself I was being sensitive. Grief and stress make people brittle. I had been brittle once too. Still, that sentence stayed with me. Not because it hurt, but because it changed the temperature in the room. Something shifted from warm to cool, from shared to separate. It was the first time I felt pushed back instead of welcomed in. I folded the moment away like a receipt I didn't want to look at. After that, small things began to line up. Advice declined. Updates delivered late or not at all. Decisions made and announced instead of discussed. Each time, I told myself I was imagining patterns that weren't there. I had always believed that love meant giving people room, so I stepped back another inch. I noticed how she stopped asking how I was doing. Calls came with purpose and ended quickly. If I tried to linger, she sounded distracted, like someone already halfway out the door. When I offered help, she accepted it without the old warmth, without eye contact, without thanks. I began to feel like a wallet with a voice attached. What unsettled me most was how calm she seemed when drawing those lines. No argument. No explosion. Just quiet exclusion. It made me doubt myself. If there had been anger, I could have addressed it. Silence is harder. Silence lets you wonder whether you deserve it. I replayed that kitchen moment more than once. Her tone. Her posture. The finality in the way she said it. At the time, I thought it was about boundaries. Looking back, I see it was about authority. She was letting me know, early and clearly, that my role was changing, and that I wasn't the one deciding how. I felt anxious in a way I couldn't explain. Not afraid, exactly, but alert, like an animal that senses weather before it arrives. I started keeping copies of things I had never needed to keep before. Bank statements. Emails. Notes from conversations. I told myself it was just good organization. That was the first crack. Small enough to ignore. Sharp enough to cut later. After that, the distance became a pattern instead of an exception. Weeks passed without a call, then months where I was the one dialing and waiting through long rings. When Jessica did answer, her voice carried a thin politeness, like we were neighbors instead of family. She spoke carefully, as if every word cost her something. I began to notice how quickly she wrapped up conversations, how rarely she asked anything that didn't require a yes or a check. Birthdays slipped by with no card, no message. I told myself people forget things when life is heavy. I reminded myself that grief rearranges priorities. Still, when my own birthday passed in silence, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee growing cold and felt something settle in my chest. Not anger. Hurt. The kind that arrives quietly and stays. There were debts, too. Small at first, then not so small. Money I had loaned with clear expectations, dates written on envelopes, conversations I remembered word for word. When I asked, gently, about repayment, she deflected. Things are tight right now. We'll talk about it later. Later never came. My requests were met with sighs, with pauses that made me feel unreasonable for asking. I felt a coldness in her words that hadn't been there before. Even through text, I could sense it. Short replies. No punctuation. Messages that read like obligations fulfilled rather than conversations shared. I reread them more than once, searching for warmth that wasn't there. The timestamps told their own story. Hours, sometimes days, before she responded, unless she needed something. The house became another quiet point of tension. The old place held memories of my son as a boy, his height marked on a doorframe, his laughter echoing in rooms that still smelled faintly of cedar. When I mentioned wanting to visit, there was always a reason it wasn't a good time. Renovations. Schedules. Too much going on. I started to feel like a guest who overstayed her welcome without ever arriving. Grief sharpened everything. I was already raw, already tired from carrying sorrow that woke me at night and followed me through the day. Each small dismissal landed harder than it might have before. I wondered if I was imagining slights because I was lonely. I wondered if my expectations were unfair. I wondered, more than once, whether I should simply accept that my place had changed. Yet my body seemed to know something my mind kept resisting. My shoulders tensed when my phone buzzed. My stomach tightened when her name appeared. I began keeping my voice even, my words careful, the way you do when you sense the ground isn't stable. The hum of the fridge at night felt louder. The house felt emptier, though nothing had been taken yet. What hurt most was the feeling of being managed. Information came filtered, delayed, stripped of detail. Decisions were presented as finished. I was no longer part of the process, only the perimeter. It was a slow exclusion, polite enough to deny but steady enough to feel. I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse. I was still hoping this was temporary, a phase brought on by strain and loss. I told myself patience was kindness. But patience, I would soon learn, can look a lot like permission when the wrong person is watching. The truth did not arrive dramatically. It came folded inside routine, disguised as paperwork. A few days after the message telling me I was blocked, I finally opened the envelope that had been sitting on my table. The paper was thick, official, the kind that smells faintly of toner and dust. I remember smoothing it flat with both hands, the way I always had, as if order could be restored by neat edges. It was a house sale agreement. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The address was ours, the old house. The date at the top read March 15, 2025. I frowned, doing the math in my head. That was days after my son's death, days when I could barely remember to eat. I turned the pages slowly, my pulse steady but heavy, like it already knew where this was going. Then I saw the price. $150,000. My breath caught. The house was worth more than that. Not wildly more, but enough that the number felt wrong. Careless. As if speed mattered more than fairness. I kept reading, my eyes tracing lines they had never seen before, clauses I had never agreed to. And then I reached the last page. My name was there. My signature sat at the bottom in black ink, confident and smooth. It looked convincing at first glance. Enough curves. Enough pressure. But it wasn't mine. I know my own hand. I know where I pause, where I press harder, where the letters lean. This signature didn't hesitate. It didn't breathe. It was an imitation done by someone who had watched me sign checks for years. I felt a sharp pain behind my eyes, like a silent scream trying to escape. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I sat very still, listening to the clock on the wall tick through seconds that suddenly felt loud. That small stamp beside the signature, the notary mark, seemed to glow on the page. Proof. Evidence. A mistake she thought I wouldn't catch. I flipped back to the dates, my finger moving carefully, as if the paper might burn me. March 15th. While I was planning a funeral. While I was choosing flowers. While I was standing in front of a casket, touching my son's sleeve for the last time. She had been arranging the sale of my home. The realization spread slowly, cold and precise. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't grief-driven chaos. It was deliberate. Calculated. She had blocked my number after the sale, not before. She wanted distance once the ink was dry. Once I was no longer necessary. What hurt most wasn't the money. It was the timing. The audacity of taking advantage of a mother while she was burying her child. The ease with which she erased me, as if years of support could be overwritten with a forged line. I gathered the pages back into a neat stack. My hands were steady, which surprised me. Somewhere beneath the pain, something else was forming. Not rage. Not despair. Recognition. I finally understood what all the small dismissals had been preparing me for. This was the betrayal they thought would end me. I stayed at the table long after the light outside shifted from afternoon to evening. The papers lay stacked in front of me, squared at the edges, as if they belonged there. I noticed small things I hadn't before: the faint scratch on the wood, the ring left by a mug I'd used that morning, the quiet click of the heater turning on. Ordinary sounds, anchoring me while something inside rearranged itself. It wasn't just that they had sold the house. It wasn't even the forged signature, though that alone was enough. What settled over me was the understanding that this had been planned in advance. Not improvised. Not panicked. Planned. While I was living my life, while I was trusting, someone else had been preparing to remove me from it. I pressed my palm flat against the envelope and felt my breathing slow. Grief had taught me that panic wastes energy. I had none to spare. I thought of my son, his careful way of doing things, his dislike of shortcuts. I imagined what he would say if he were sitting across from me. He would tell me to read everything twice. He would tell me not to rush. They hadn't just betrayed me. They had tried to rewrite my role entirely. Mother became inconvenience. Owner became obstacle. My money, my memories, my authority, all treated as resources to be extracted before I could object. And once taken, I was meant to disappear quietly, blocked and isolated, too stunned to fight back. I realized then how deliberate the silence had been. The missed calls. The delayed replies. The careful distancing. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was preparation. Distance makes theft easier. Silence creates plausible deniability. By the time I was locked out, the work was already done. For the first time since my son's death, I felt something other than loss. Clarity arrived without drama. It was cool and steady, like clean water. I saw the situation for what it was, not what I wished it to be. I understood that if I did nothing, this version of events would stand. Paper has a way of pretending to be truth if no one challenges it. I stood up and walked to the shelf by the window. There was a candle there, the one I had lit every night since the funeral. Lavender scented, simple, nothing decorative. I struck a match and watched the flame catch, small but determined. I didn't ask for guidance. I didn't bargain. I simply acknowledged what was. This stops now. I chose myself in that moment. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. I owed my son the dignity of truth. I owed myself the right to exist beyond someone else's convenience. Whatever came next would be handled quietly, properly, and in daylight. I closed the envelope, slid it into my bag, and washed my hands at the sink. The water was warm. My reflection in the window looked tired, but it didn't look defeated. Grief was still there. It always would be. But it no longer stood alone. I blew out the candle before bed, knowing I would light it again. Some rituals are for remembrance. Others are for resolve. The next morning, I woke before the alarm, the way grief trains you to do. The house was still dark, and for a moment I lay there listening to my own breathing, steady and calm. The decision I had made the night before hadn't faded. If anything, it had hardened into something reliable. After coffee, I sat at my desk and made one call. Thomas Baker answered on the second ring. He had been my lawyer for years, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke and never reacted until he had all the facts. When I told him I needed an urgent appointment, he didn't ask why. He just said, "Come in today," and named a time. I brought everything with me. The envelope. The sale agreement. Old signatures pulled from files and check copies I had kept without knowing why. My hands didn't shake as I laid the papers out across his conference table. Thomas studied them in silence, his pen tapping once, then stopping. "This isn't your signature," he said finally. Hearing it out loud mattered more than I expected. Not validation, confirmation. He explained the process carefully, without drama. We would challenge the sale. We would contest the notarization. We would file immediately. There was no lecture, no sympathy that blurred into pity. Just steps. Clear and procedural. We moved quickly after that. He placed calls while I signed affidavits. I authorized freezes on accounts that had been touched after my son's death. Trust documents were reviewed line by line. Access that had been quietly granted over the years was revoked just as quietly. Each signature I placed that day felt different from the forged one. Mine paused where it always had. Mine carried weight. I learned things in that office. Dates I hadn't known. Attempts that hadn't gone through. Plans that had been interrupted only because someone, somewhere, had followed protocol. It turned out not everything had gone as smoothly as she had hoped. Paperwork leaves trails. Money remembers where it has been. By late afternoon, the foundation had shifted. The house sale was flagged. The funds were no longer reachable. Authority returned to its rightful place, not with a confrontation, but with filings and confirmations. I walked out into the cool air feeling lighter than I had in weeks. I didn't call her. I didn't text. There was nothing to say. The time for explanation had passed. Boundaries, I learned, are most effective when they don't argue. That evening, I returned home and unlocked my door with the same keys I'd always used. The familiar weight in my hand felt grounding. I cooked something simple, washed the dishes, and lit the candle again. The flame reflected in the window, steady and upright. For the first time since the message that blocked me, I slept through the night. Not because everything was over, but because I had acted. I had stepped back into my own life, not loudly, not publicly, but completely. The decision wasn't revenge. It was correction. And it had already begun to work. The consequences didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. They came the way real consequences usually do, through interruptions, denials, and quiet reversals that couldn't be argued away. Within days, Jessica discovered that the ground beneath her plans was no longer solid. The refinance she had already set in motion stalled first. Then it was rejected outright. The bank flagged the sale, the signature, the timing. Questions were asked that she couldn't answer cleanly. Documents she had relied on were suddenly under review. What she had assumed was finished business became unfinished, uncertain, and exposed. She tried to move forward anyway. I know because neighbors told me later, carefully, as if they weren't sure what I already knew. Contractors didn't return calls. Appointments were postponed. People who had once nodded politely began asking for clarification she didn't have. Confidence drains quickly when it has nothing firm to stand on. Her standing in the community shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Invitations dried up. Conversations shortened. People who had once admired her efficiency now looked at her with caution. No one accused her openly. They didn't need to. The situation spoke for itself. Financial disputes have a way of carrying their own warnings. What she lost wasn't just money, though there was that too. Fees accumulated. Opportunities vanished. Plans that depended on quick cash and clean records dissolved one by one. Control slipped through her fingers because it had never truly been hers to begin with. It had been borrowed, assumed, and then taken too far. She reached out once, indirectly, through a neutral third party. The message was brief and carefully worded, as if testing the temperature of the room. I declined to respond. Silence, this time, was not avoidance. It was a boundary. I had said everything that mattered through proper channels. I felt no satisfaction watching it unfold. No triumph. What I felt was a sober kind of balance returning. Actions had met resistance. Choices had met consequence. The scale corrected itself without my intervention. Justice, I learned, doesn't always need an audience. There were moments when grief resurfaced unexpectedly, braided with disappointment. I thought of my son, of how this fallout would have wounded him. I mourned not just what had been taken, but what had been broken beyond repair. Some relationships don't survive the truth, even when the truth is necessary. Still, I didn't waver. Each update from my lawyer confirmed what I already knew. The attempt to erase me had failed. The system she relied on required legitimacy, and legitimacy demands consent. She had neither. In the quiet aftermath, I understood something important. Consequences don't have to be cruel to be complete. They only need to be accurate. And accuracy, once introduced, has a way of finishing the work on its own. Once the legal noise settled into routine updates and waiting periods, my own life began to open in small, careful ways. I didn't rush. I had learned what haste can cost. Instead, I focused on creating a space that belonged to me alone, shaped by intention rather than obligation. I bought a modest house in the Tacoma suburbs. Nothing grand. 2 bedrooms, good light, a yard that caught the afternoon sun. The first time I walked through it, I noticed the quiet. Not the empty kind, but the peaceful kind, the kind that doesn't demand anything. I signed the papers slowly, aware of my own hand, my own pauses, my own authority. When I turned the key for the first time, I felt something loosen inside my chest. Emily came to visit not long after. She had grown taller than I expected, her voice steadier, her questions thoughtful. She lives nearby now, close enough for weekend lunches and unplanned walks. We talk about school, about books she's reading, about ordinary things. I don't press her for information. I don't ask her to choose sides. I simply show up, consistently, the way I always have. Children understand safety without explanation. My days found a new rhythm. Mornings with coffee by the window. Afternoons spent planting roses along the fence, my hands in the soil, the scent clinging to my skin long after I washed up. I joined a small book club at the local library. Nothing heavy. Just stories shared among people who listen. I volunteer twice a week, quietly, without needing recognition. Service feels different when it's chosen freely. The candle still sits on the shelf by the window. I light it on certain evenings, not out of sorrow alone, but remembrance. My son is part of my life, not its shadow. I speak his name without flinching now. Grief has softened into something I can carry without losing my balance. Freedom, I learned, isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up as ease. As rest. As the absence of dread when the phone rings. I sleep better. I breathe deeper. I make plans without wondering who will resent them. There are moments when sadness returns, unexpected and sharp. Loss doesn't disappear just because justice was served. But those moments pass more quickly now. They don't pull me under. I have built enough ground beneath my feet to stand. What surprised me most was how little I missed the old role I had been playing. The fixer. The fallback. The silent provider. Letting go of that identity felt like setting down a weight I had been carrying so long I forgot it wasn't required. This is my balance now. Not perfect. Not untouched by pain. But honest. And entirely my own. I've learned something I didn't fully understand until now. My worth does not depend on whether anyone recognizes it, whether anyone bows to my sacrifices, or whether anyone acknowledges my grief. I spent decades pouring myself into my family, my time, my energy, my money, and for a moment, I felt invisible. Erased. Blocked. Like my existence could be overlooked as if it had no weight at all. But that silence, that emptiness left by betrayal, taught me something vital. I am alive, and my life is mine to shape, regardless of anyone else's approval or opinion. In the quiet of my new home, I feel the freedom I had almost forgotten existed. Every morning, I walk through the garden I planted myself, inhaling the scent of roses and fresh earth, listening to the birds sing in the pale light. Emily laughs across the yard, and her laughter feels like sunlight bouncing off every corner of my heart. I no longer wait for calls that may never come. I no longer measure my value in their gratitude or acceptance. My walls, my windows, my floors, they carry the calm of my choices, the evidence of my own care. I realize that strength isn't loud. It doesn't need announcements or vindication. Strength is quiet, procedural, and steady. It is the act of standing up for yourself when others try to erase you, of claiming what is yours without malice, and of refusing to let bitterness define the rest of your life. I have boundaries now that I respect, and I surround myself with people and routines that honor me. Each decision is a small act of self-respect, planting a rose, finishing a book, baking a pie for Emily. Each act reminds me that I am the author of my life, not the audience to someone else's whims. I am strong. I choose myself. I am alive. And in that clarity, there is a joy that no betrayal can touch. The past still whispers, but it no longer controls me. I carry the memory of my son in every gentle ritual, every quiet victory, every laugh shared in our new home. Life is softer now, slower, richer in ways I never allowed before. I've discovered that the deepest, most reliable justice is the one we grant ourselves, the decision to keep living fully, calmly, and with dignity. If you've ever felt silenced, invisible, or cast aside, know this: you are not powerless. You belong here. You can rebuild. And one day, you will see the life that is waiting for you beyond the hurt, waiting quietly for you to step into it.